to studying melanin come together and publish every 4 years. So if you're not a member of the Klan, then you have to pay for it. It's $650. And it was interesting because most of the contributors and researchers were from universities or from countries where most of the people were melanin recessive. And one of the things that's what I thought was very interesting. So obviously the specimens that they used for their research didn't come from them. It had to come from people who were melanin dominant. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I found in those volumes, and this is the last volume, when they talked about the melanoopiotropic molecule, that's how they referred to it. Okay.
Opiotropic.
That's correct, because part of the structure of melanin is exactly like the opiate drugs. It's almost like a cousin, which is one of the reasons why melanin-dominant individuals who participate in the misuse of opiate drugs have a very hard time detoxing from it, because the melanin molecule absorbs it and attaches to it, thinking that it's part of itself. So they discovered and recognized that wherever melanin was placed on a petri dish with a virus, and especially the HIV virus, the virus could not grow. And in the book, they talked about the fact that this was very exciting because melanin was one of the new drugs that was going to be looked at as a treatment for HIV and virulent viral diseases.
Now, it's interesting because the fellow that called it was an AIDS researcher, and he was very much interested in the differences between people. I don't know that he got that far with his research with melanin, but I do remember when Dr. King, Richard King, was a guest on Black Talk, he talked about the inability or the difficulty it is for melanin-dominant people to kick the habit, if you will, of those opiate drugs.
Because it's because the melanin molecule reads it as part of itself and binds to it. And so if the drug rehab programs do not have within the program a protocol that splices the opiate off of the melanin molecule, these individuals have an extremely high recidivism rate. And to this day, I don't know any publicly funded programs that have looked at nutrition that is necessary for the melanin-dominant individual and has supplied them with the chelators, because you use a chelator to actually cut that off. That will actually then allow that to be excreted through the kidneys or liver out of the system so these individuals can be free.
And a chelator is what?
A chelator is a substance that actually binds, based on the molecular charge, to another compound, making it now have a neutral effect in the system where it can actually be eliminated.
So let me just go back a little bit. You made the distinction that melanin-dominated and melanin-recessive people are definitely different types of people.
Immune function is different. Neurologic awareness is different, etc. Even our circulation is different. And when you look at the need that for every melanin molecule, there's a neuron that goes to it. There's an artery and a vein that goes to it, because that's what's necessary to nurture the melanocyte. Then the structure is obviously different, because you're not going to have the same amount of perfusion of nerves, arteries, and veins to a surface area that doesn't have a melanocyte. And if the melanocyte secretes very little melanin, which is what happens in Caucasians, they don't have the same blood supply. So it's real obvious. This is why Caucasians, for example, it's known that they have a well-developed deep circulation, but a very poorly developed superficial circulation. So therefore, they become very heat intolerant very fast, because they have no way of dissipating the ambient heat that they're absorbing from the environment, as opposed to melanin-dominant individuals who have the melanin on the surface. I told you that the property of melanin is that it absorbs heat and then actually gives it back into the environment. So it actually acts like a cooling system. That's part of what superconductivity is about. And so we can be in very, very warm climates and not find it debilitating at all. Caucasians cannot do that, and the fairer they are, that is with less melanin, that the granules are so small, etc., they become just prostrate. This is one reason why they find that when it becomes warm, they feel much more comfortable disrobed. Where in Africa, you can go into the deepest part of Africa, and these individuals will have all kind of things on their bodies that Caucasians cannot wear.
So,
And as a matter of fact, when we go to Egypt and we're out on the desert, we're not out on the desert with no clothes on, because we find that basically covering yourself is very, very important, because as that heat is given off, you don't want to dehydrate. You don't want to have, you have to maintain moisture. So your clothes become moist underneath, and the skin can stay moist without you having to drink excess water, but the heat is actually dissipated. So any of the bedouins, etc., you see them, they're not without clothing on the desert. They're very heavily layered. But Caucasians cannot tolerate that when they go into that environment.
because we are different, so then that means we have to eat differently. We
course.
as black people shouldn't eat the same things white people eat.
Of course.
So when
That's why dogs and cats don't eat the same thing, and that's why rabbits and squirrels don't.
So we as black folk really need to watch. I mean, they advertise and market milk, dairy, and cheese products.
88% of the African world population cannot tolerate dairy products because they don't have the lactase enzyme to break down the milk sugar. And so, no, after the age of 5, we become very intolerant to that, and it becomes mucus-producing for us. See, this is part of the science known as human ecology. And in conventional medicine, this has totally been lost. And this is why so few people benefit from Western medicine. And when I say so few, I'm saying that any other race that tries to utilize Western medicine doesn't do well, other than the Caucasian. Other than the Caucasian. So therefore, the Orientals know what the medicine is they need. They are basically plant-based because they have melanin, and plants work much better for them and for us, as opposed to a lot of artificially synthetic, concentrated drugs. So therefore, with this melanin that we have that has propensity to store and to recycle, etc., you know, we can't take in a lot of things that are not biologically in balance. But that is not the situation with the Caucasian. So I'm saying that they can tolerate more of those unique substances than we can. And because we try to ingest them, they have a totally different half-life in our body. Many times they become very, very deleterious, etc., and they really should not be used. So I'm saying that, you know, it's very important that if medicine in general is going to make changes in the world to bring up the quality of health, they're going to have to recognize the uniqueness of the individual and honor his or her anatomical structure and genetic orientation. It's very, very important. I was reading an article here where they were talking about the genome of humans, and they were saying that, you know, out of every 100 genes, every 1,000 genes, it's only the 1,001 position in the DNA that makes an individual different from another individual. But that is important, because obviously if you stand me next to a Caucasian female with blonde hair and blue eyes, and here I am with olive brown skin, black hair, and brown eyes, etc., that 1,001 gene is critical, that you have to honor that. I beg to differ with this gentleman that, you know, he just does not have access to the research, so I don't know if he's melanin recessive or melanin dominant or not, but for my own survival and for my capacity to really make changes in people that my colleagues told were going to die, I had to dig deeper and I had to dig harder to get these answers so that those patients that came to me could really have their life back. And so my reputation speaks for itself that I had to use a different type of medicine, a different type technique, so that these people who had been given a death sentence now are living.
One of the things referenced at the media conference that the Whitehead Institute held yesterday, Eric Lander, the director of the Whitehead Institute, or the Human Genome Project, he kept referencing that human beings are 99.9% the same, and most of the DNA strands, most of humanity evolved from 50,000 Africans in sub-Saharan Africa, and so there isn't that much difference between us as human beings. You just made reference to that, is that correct? But
I just said that they have cited that every 1,001 gene is where you see the difference. But that 1,001 gene is critical for your identity and must be honored. So this is my point, is that we cannot just deal with the 1,000 genes that are alike. Because if you do that, then you're going to kill off everything who has a different 1,001 gene. And that's exactly what's happening.
I also want to reference the conversation that we had with Dr. Eric Lander yesterday, and when we spoke of cancer, and he said that lung cancer was one of those things that you couldn't cure yourself of. Yet, as I read your materials, Dr. Joel Pookrum, MD, PhD, staff physician and medical director of the GNLD Wellness Center, standing for Golden Neolife Diamite, and hopefully we'll get to some understanding of what that is, that you've directed departments of OBGYN at Woodrow Wilson Clinic for the Henry Ford Hospital. You're a graduate of Creighton University School of Medicine, and you studied and practiced many of the modalities of medicine. Yet you yourself used your training and more to heal yourself of lung cancer.
Of course.
How did you do that?
Who have had lung cancer and have healed themselves. And so, look, guess what? When I decided at first I was going to be a neurosurgeon, I recognized that, and no disrespect to my instructors, that they didn't know much about the brain. And my thing was is that, I'm not going to be a bearer of bad tidings, that every time I took you to surgery, you were either coming out of the operating room in a coma, or you were going to be a hemiplegic or paraplegic or quadriplegic or blind, or you couldn't hear, or you might not be able to speak. So thank goodness there were other people like myself in that specialty that forged forward and said, yes, we can do this in a different way. No, we don't have to have everybody in a coma. And thank goodness now neurosurgery is something that you can look forward to and not come out basically a vegetable. Hear me very clearly, is that there's no such thing as a disease that cannot be healed.
Hallelujah.
And this has been the...
Now, if you notice, 9 out of the 12 months of the year, my store was number one. Although it was 40 miles from the nearest town, out in the middle of the desert, my 9 months of the year, my store was number one every month. But I retired. I retired from that store. It was actually 10 months. But 1 month was the year before January. It was the previous December before January. I was also number one that year also. And if you notice in the picture where I retire, if you see the lady that's with me, that's Carolyn. Carolyn was the manager of the store in the middle at the Boulevard Mall in the middle of Las Vegas. That was her store. My store beat every other store. However, if you notice, although my store was number one 9 months out of the year, out in the middle of the desert, did you notice I was never manager of the month? Can you tell me why? So I retired from driving out. I had to drive 40 to 45 miles a day, one way, to go to work every day for almost 2 years. And back and forth. I was making more money working part-time as a bartender in Las Vegas. So I retired from Vitamin World Store in Primm, Nevada. And if you want to check it out, check out Primm, Nevada in 2003. You'll see it's in the middle of nowhere. After that, I became a bartender all over Las Vegas. I worked at MGM, I worked Thomas & Mack. I'll show you all of my credentials of working as a bartender. And I did fabulously as a bartender. I worked every famous show that there was. I didn't get to work Sammy Davis Jr., Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin. I didn't get to work them, but right on the other side of them, I worked everybody from them to Lady Gaga. I worked every show there was. After them, to Lady Gaga and Ed Sheridan, I worked theirs, and I worked Mayweather's fight that he had when he established himself as 50 wins with no loss at the T-Mobile. I worked that also. What I did is I worked the circuit, and whenever they had a big events, they would call me to come work at those big events. But I worked every event at the Orleans Arena and at Thomas and Mack, which included Sam Boyd Stadium and Cashman Field. Well, not Cashman Field, but Sam Boyd Stadium. Thomas and Mack is the basketball arena for UNLV. And at one time, it was the biggest arena in Las Vegas. All the big events, a lot of the big fights and the big events was always there. Now they've built bigger arenas in Las Vegas, but at that time, nothing was bigger than the Thomas and Mack. And we had a lot of great concerts and out at Sam Boyd Stadium. Sam Boyd Stadium is the football stadium for UNLV. And then we would go out there. And then I also worked for 17 years at the track. I worked out at the Las Vegas Motor Speedway. Every time NASCAR came into town or the NHRA came into town, I worked that also. And I worked that until I retired. Okay, now, after this, I've got one more segment that I want to show you. And that's, they came before Columbus. Now, think about it. I've showed you that the first people on earth were black people. So that means the first people to travel all over the earth. Like Sheikh Anta Diop said, if the black man had never left Africa, there would be nobody else in the United States. I mean, nobody else in the world. Nobody else nowhere, and if he had never left. So that's why, for years here in America, we had Columbus Day. We celebrated Columbus as discovering America. But if you think about it, and if you look at the reading and the pictures and the writings, Columbus met people when he got here. There were people already here. How can you discover something that's already occupied? And this next segment will prove that. And that's going to be the last segment. And then I'm going to introduce you to some wonderful people who helped me put this together. They did the photograph for me and helped me print up a lot of the paperwork. And without them, it could not have happened. So here, we're going to go to They Came Before Columbus.